Good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Doing all right? Are we awake? Get coffee? I think I need just one more coffee, right? Thank you for joining us. My name is John Martinez from Evident.io, and this is Anthony Johnson from Ellie Mae, and he'll give a little bit of intro about himself in a little bit. But thank you for coming and talking together today about the AWS hero's journey of achieving, it's a really long title, autonomous self-healing security. That's a pretty long title, right? So we're going to talk a lot about a journey. We've all embarked on this journey. And just by a show of hands, how many of you have been using AWS less than a year? Not too many. Okay, cool, but enough. How many of you guys are like, less than like 3 years? You're kind of adopting. Okay, good chunk. How many of you guys are old fogies like me? You've been using AWS for like 7 years. Oh, pretty cool. Awesome. So we're going to talk about this journey about how do I get autonomous in my security processes. Also, but just by a really quick show of hands, how many of you are dedicated security folks? That's your job, your cloud security, InfoSec, et cetera. How many of you are DevOps, operations? How many of you are developers? How many of you are both or all three? Another good chunk, right? That's good. A lot of polyglots in here, so that's good. So here's a little bit of the story that we're going to talk about today. Programmatic security, that's a big chunk of the journey of going there. We're going to talk a little bit about the CIS, AWS Foundations Benchmark, how benchmarks play a role in security. A little bit of compliance, the topic that's near and dear to all of us, all of our hearts as operations folks or developers. We absolutely love to hate compliance, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'll introduce you guys to a couple of programs, the AWS Security by Design program, a little bit of what Evident.io, my company, does. And as well, in between, I'm going to ask Anthony to share a little bit of what he has to say, and he has to say a lot, so highly recommend to listen to Anthony. But at the very end, we're going to sort of wrap it up with how do we exploit the bots? And that's really where the meat of gaining that autonomy happens and taking stock. So a little bit about myself. I've worked in the cloud since 2010. Did a little bit of work over at that large streaming company in Los Gatos, if you know what that is. But more previously than Evident.io, I worked at Adobe Systems, where I was leading a team of DevOps engineers, automation engineers on the creative cloud side of the house. And I've been doing Unix work for a really long time. And just a little bit about myself, I like making latte art at home. I work from home now full time, and I bought myself a really nice espresso machine, so making latte art is one of my passions. So if you have any YouTube channels that you like for making latte art, or you're better than me, I would absolutely love to get some tips afterward from you. So definitely come up and let me know about that. But let me introduce to you Anthony Johnson from Ellie Mae. Anthony.
Cool. Well, the mic works good. Start with the obvious. I'm hoarse, so thank you Vegas, thank you AWS, and also, since everybody can see, I do wear a man purse. My coworkers are keen to tell me about it all the time, so I wear it with pride. So my name's Anthony Johnson. I currently work at Ellie Mae. I like to consider myself a full stack engineer. Which apparently many of you also do, and so I shared kinship in the room. And John stole this from LinkedIn, so I didn't even know it said that on LinkedIn, but apparently it does. So essentially, not yet. I'm still talking about me. So
Sorry.
So essentially, give a reason why I think I'm a full stack engineer and why you should care to listen to me. I mean, I guess I started off in operations, doing what most people see in operations, which is, I went to be a Unix admin when I was in high school, and because that was the cool job at the time, back when Windows 95 was out. So it quickly figured out Windows admin was actually a very, very boring job. That really the automation of the core was what was needed, and nobody was really doing reports, and nobody was really spreading the love across the organizations. It was really just the Unix admin keeping the thing running and giving out shell accounts. So I ended up quickly in my career starting to do automation and programming, and And then, the ops and dev divide. I was ended up told that, I went to the dark side. I went to product development, and it's a shame that that's what they thought. It was, the dark side guy that went over there. And of course, on the other side, they said, you came from the dark side, and that's what it was. So I did product development. I ended up getting into hardcore product development. I ended up in a great role in Nokia, which was for me a big deal because I had started with a lot of startups. And at Nokia, I did product development for about 4 years. Nokia scale was really good for me. We did data synchronization from mobile phones all the way back to a private data center. Lots of hardware, lots of great Sun equipment, and pretty crazy days. So, but product development leaves your scope very narrow. So I ended up jumping back to operations because that's where all the fun is. I mean, realistically. So there was no such thing as DevOps, but I jumped back to operations and still ended up doing programming on that side. So it sort of ended up into this making products for operations. And then Nokia made the switch from private cloud to public cloud, AWS, probably about 4 or 5 years ago. I was lucky enough to be into the core. Everybody has one probably in their company, or should think about having one. Their cloud platform team, and AWS. We ended up with 300 accounts. We were pretty much a you build it, you run it type shop. So the idea was that the developers needed to develop an app, and we needed to control blast radius. We needed to be able to give costs back to them. Needed to really be able to give them control of their destiny and get us out of the dependency chain. So we had a very much here's your dev account, go do whatever you want in it. You mess it up, we'll scorch earth it. And then also we had production accounts. So, but the neat thing about this is we had 300 accounts, and we managed it with 3 people. So it's a really neat story that I hope you guys understand here and see where we took it. So so I myself have the great thing about these skills is that all these a lot of companies have these same problems. So it's a marketable skill, and I wanted to move to the West Coast. So I ended up moving to Ellie Mae. So now we can go to Ellie Mae. So my slides aren't very exciting, so it's really hard to collaborate on these things. So you have to listen to me, unfortunately. I'll try to provide lots of colorful words. But so Ellie Mae is a West Coast company, East Bay. For those of you who are not familiar with the San Francisco Bay Area, it's basically San Francisco and the peninsula, Silicon Valley. You go a little bit east, you hit Oakland, you go a little bit further east, and where everybody actually lives is the East Bay, a little bit east of Oakland. And there's Pleasanton, San Ramon, Dublin, Danville, and a few others. So it's a nice little area to get away from the city. But essentially, Ellie Mae was making the same transition to the cloud. They were very early. They had maybe 2 or 3 accounts when I joined. But the stories were all the same. How do we manage? How do we scale in AWS? How do we move forward? How do we go there? And so who is Ellie Mae? I realized I didn't even say what we do. So we are not a government entity. We are basically a publicly traded company that was started in 1997 around the idea of automating everything in real estate. So our mortgage brokers and banks are our primary customers. And we essentially automating the transactions. So you go, you want to get your rate. We handle managing all the rates. That house inspection, hopefully the bank is ordering it through using our system. And we currently process about 25 to 30% of mortgages that flow through this company. So there's a good chance we actually have a good slice of people's data in this room and in our back end. We're a lot of the nuts and bolts behind the mortgage industry. Before I started a long time ago, there was a bad crash in our private cloud system, and the federal government kind of came in and got mad at us. So it's a pretty interesting company, pretty central, kind of behind the scenes for most people. So I ended up at Ellie Mae because they have essentially a lot of the same problems that every other company has, or at least maybe a lot of you have, which is I have all these people trying to go 1,000 miles an hour in AWS. How do I control the chaos without turning it back into the private data center, essentially, or putting myself in the dependency chain? And so at Nokia, we wrote a whole bunch of code, but essentially, they brought me in to help lead this team, and together with a bunch of other smart people. And and so why did I make the move? Marketable skills. Ellie Mae had a great story behind being a best of the Bay type of company to work at. but get to the Bay, and so it was really a good opportunity for me. And of course, I'm inheriting a whole bunch of private cloud mess again, but that's what we all do this for. So that's really about about me and Ellie Mae and how I ended up at Ellie Mae. I'm going to hand it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Clicker, work. There you go. So let's talk a little bit about Evident.io and the programmatic security story. Let's get a little bit into that. So Evident.io, we have the ESP platform, which is the Evident Security platform. We're a new generation security platform. We really are designed for the cloud, in the cloud. A little bit of the story comes of the genesis of Evident.io comes from a lot of the lessons we learned at Adobe doing Creative Cloud at scale, or AWS at scale. Really hundreds of AWS accounts and tens of thousands of EC2 instances. How many of you guys are in that boat today? Really large scale, right? Even if you're not, there's a lot of things to learn from those of us that have been doing AWS at scale. Things like, patterns like using auto-scaling for a lot of the way you launch your EC2 instances. But the idea, though, about securing that number of AWS accounts at scale really goes and makes a difference for your accounts, even if you're not at that level of scale, right? So really it comes about having that security visibility across your entire footprint. Also, one of the things that we're really big proponents of is the shared security responsibility model. When I asked, and I know a lot of you here get it, a lot of you raised your hand that you were polyglots in both security and DevOps and development. So it's something that is a shared responsibility. We get that. We know that. I'm preaching in many respects to the choir in that regard. So it's one that within our product, and I'm not going to go into a product pitch, but just a little bit of background here, where we absolutely envisioned that sort of state of security and DevOps, and we've gone and implemented it. We do continuous security monitoring. We're doing this via APIs. So we're relatively light scale. We're not asking for you to install an agent or doing some other crazy things like that, because a lot of us have been through agent burnout, right? Oh my God, another agent that I got to go install on all this stuff and write whatever configuration management for just to manage that thing, right? So anyway, so we're doing this through the AWS Service APIs and through CloudTrail. So we actually do ingest AWS CloudTrail event data and make correlations between the security findings that we discover in your AWS accounts and CloudTrail, and give you the ability to correlate those security events and kind of take a nice little view. One of my customers actually said that they were going to try and build a wall of shame with this this powerful correlation data, right? Who are the bad guys in my environment, right? So that's what we do. That's what Evident.io does. From the get-go, though, big believers in APIs. Obviously, we consume the AWS Service APIs at really large scale. So we're all about the APIs. The platform itself lends itself to that model as well. Anthony will talk a little bit about that in a little bit here, but really, when it comes to programmatic security, that is where we are. We're about programmatic security. APIs are a big part of our platform. This is just a really quick screenshot of our API development documents. And pretty much, with a few exceptions, and we're getting better at it, based on a lot of the feedback of customers like Anthony have given us, where they're pushing our platform even further out into their automation in their organizations. We're building a lot of that into the platform. But we have both a control plane and a data plane API. So again, security is programmatic, or can be programmatic. And that's absolutely part of what we preach at Evident.io. We also have output integrations. So these integrations make for some very interesting places to take your security data. From the get-go, we don't believe that this security data should be held hostage in our SaaS platform, so we are a SaaS platform. It's your data. You should be able to do with your data whatever you want. One of the things that we do have, so some of us are using, where's the laser? I don't think it. So absolutely, we have some wonderful partners. As of today, we're also going to announce that we've added Sumo Logic to our list of partners, so we're very happy about that. And I'll show a little bit of screenshot in a little bit. So that you can go and take your data and do some more advanced things with it. Again, this is your security data. A lot of our customers are either working on or starting to implement workflows, security workflows, either through things like ServiceNow or Jira, et cetera. But they're absolutely taking this data that we generate and actioning that data in some way. We also have our sort of catch-all integrations. The SNS integration, a really, really powerful one. I'll show you guys in a little bit an example of how you can use SNS to exploit the bots. So, have AWS do the work for you. But these are some of just examples of some of the integrations that we have. Up on the screen here, we have a sample Ruby script of how a customer could take the evident.io SDK, so this is using our Ruby SDK, and programmatically adding their accounts into the evident.io platform. Now, with that said, how many of you guys are excited like I am about AWS Organizations? Right? It's going to make our life super easy, right? We love that, right? So definitely we're going to work on adding organizations into our workflows as well. But I'm super excited about getting my hands on it, first of all. I haven't had my hands on it yet. But just looking over some of the really early API calls that I see in it, I'm very excited about touching it. But before AWS Organizations, we had to solve this problem. Really what it comes down to is at the very beginning of being programmatic, you have to be able to manage your accounts. One of the philosophies that we learned really early on with doing AWS at scale was the concept, and the security thereof, was the concept of blast radius. Anthony talked a little bit about blast radius. So just really quickly, and if you don't want to raise your hand, that's fine. How many of you guys separate your AWS accounts by environment? Let's say dev, stage, production. How many of you guys are running everything in one AWS account? Okay. Cool.
Low hand.
So, yeah, that's fine. There's several ways to skin this cat, obviously. In the single account, multiple environment, you have to basically become an IAM ninja, right? IAM policy ninja, right? So bow down. Because you want to separate a lot of the permissions, you want to follow a lot of the security best practices around least privilege, where you don't want to give too much privilege to certain users in your environment. But definitely an easier way to do that would be to create more AWS accounts. Now, some of you are thinking, well, is that really easier, right? Why do you think AWS Organizations exists now, right? It's not necessarily easier. But what it does gain you is it gains you an isolated environment with which you can control access, and literally from a security perspective, with which you can control a little bit more the exploitability of your AWS accounts. I've lived several times at 3 in the morning, gotten a call for a security incident where an AWS account was compromised. How many of you guys have misplaced an AWS API access key, right? It's happened. It's okay. But getting that nastygram, some of us have seen that nastygram email that AWS Security sends you that says, usually comes from like this really terse email address, like abuse@aws.amazon.com or something like that, right? It says, hey, this EC2 instance is being used as a source of abuse for a bunch of other stuff. You might want to go take a look at that. Some of us have seen that, right? So the idea here again is I'm trying to nail down that definitely when it comes to programmatic security, taking care of the basics, just gaining visibility into your AWS environment is key to start out with. So that's, again, we're very big proponents, and we have an SDK that allows our customers to go and implement automatic account creation into the Evident platform. Another use case that I'll talk about is analyzing data in some kind of big data or logging analytics platform. What you're looking at there is screenshots of our Sumo Logic integration. And the ability for you to export, again, we're using the SNS integration that we have to ship a lot of this data that we've generated, which depending on the size and the activity that you have going on in your AWS accounts, it can be pretty large. We're talking thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of alerts an hour. So we can be very noisy. So sifting through a lot of that, while our platform has a really nice user interface that allows you to look at all of your alerts, a lot of times, there's not a human hanging onto the Evident console. So we definitely partner up. Sumo Logic is a great partner of ours, where we work closely with them on developing this integration. And we also have integrations like I showed you earlier with other partners. But definitely it's something that a lot of our customers are taking, and they're building that building block of exporting the data and ingesting it into a place that makes that data actionable. Data is great, but without me being able to action it from a security operations perspective really means nothing, right? So I can have tens of thousands of alerts, and if I don't action them, they'll just become noise. So that's the idea, is that we don't want this data to just become noise to you from a security perspective. So the journey to security automation maturity. So let's talk a little bit about that and what that looks like. We have several buckets that I placed the maturity model into. There's a place where we get into the proactive. This is where we integrate security into our CI/CD toolchain. How many of you guys, by a show of hands, I know a lot of us are doing smoke tests and A/B tests and that kind of thing in our CI/CD, but how many of you guys are embedding security testing into your CI/CD toolchain? Awesome. That's good. So that's being proactive. Scanning my CloudFormation templates, making sure that those things that go out and create resources in an automated and programmatic fashion are also secured ahead of time. So that's the proactive side of it. Code analysis and review, pre and post deployed testing, A/B testing, all of that stuff. The continuous part of it is where I would say a lot of us are. We're in that section where, we may have certain things that we're doing. Maybe we're doing vulnerability scanning. There's some things that we might have inherited from the data center days that we're still doing in AWS. Logging, auto-scaling. Auto-scaling is kind of an interesting one, right? That's one that I've definitely learned that from the perspective of denial of service, auto-scaling is a great thing to have there set up, even if there's an instance of one, because if something kills that instance, it's nice to have that insurance policy that another instance is going to go replace that. Config management, et cetera. Then we get into sort of the ultimate state that we call self-healing. This is where I'm doing things like auto-remediation, where I'm generating some kind of alert or some kind of nugget of data where I'm saying that there's a problem, and I'm using something like AWS Lambda, for example, to go and fix that automatically for me. We're doing things here like rolling back to known good states, failovers, right? This is kind of like the more advanced stuff, being autonomous, being self-healing. Let AWS do the work for you kind of stuff. How many of you guys would say, by a show of hands, that you're continuous? You've got stuff in security operations, you got logging going. How many of you guys are self-healing? How many of you guys are actually doing stuff, reacting to things? Nuke it, right? If it's not working, nuke it out. Send it out of orbit. So now I'm going to hand it back off to Anthony, and he's going to talk about how Ellie Mae is using automation in their environment. So Anthony.
Sure. So we know a little bit more now about the Evident.io platform, and maybe some of you already knew a little bit about it. So I mentioned earlier that when I was at Nokia, and I worked for both the old Nokia and the new Nokia. So new Nokia was Microsoft had bought the mobile device division, and I didn't go with that part to Microsoft. I stayed with the new Nokia, which was essentially Nokia Networks and the mapping division. And honestly, the mapping division is what was in AWS. We lost like maybe like $200 worth of AWS spend when we gave that to Microsoft. But essentially the bulk of it stayed. And so we ended up with a platform. I mentioned 300 AWS accounts, and we had a team of 3 that managed this. And this team actually never really got over like 4 people in its entirety. So it goes a lot to the credit of the power of AWS. The way we managed it at Nokia was essentially writing a lot of code. There was really nothing on the market that could do what we required, which was we had lots of business logic, lots of demands on accounts. So a centralized cloud platform team, from my perspective, has several things to do in the business. One is to enable the internal customers. So we have developers, even folks in marketing. They want to be able to do marketing demos and things. And so those are all customers. And then we so finding ways to make them more productive and getting out of the way. The other is, of course, training, making sure that they're good, and then really sort of this giving out accounts and managing the accounts, sort of a security perspective. And so we wrote code that audited all the accounts. So we had a dev account and we had a prod account, and we treated them slightly different. And there's several reasons for that. And I was actually very happy. So we wrote tons of code to remediate, know all of the Nokia business logic, the here mapping business logic, and I was dedicated not to rewrite that platform when I left, just because it was a beast to maintain, and the problem is that it's always changing, and so a new feature comes out, and we love automation, but we're like, gee, now we've got to go work on this monolithic Java app, and we've got to go extend it, and that wasn't actually even the hard part. The hard part was actually the communication out to the audience. So, like I said, we're enabling development. So I want to be able to. I don't want to have to go fix all these problems. I want to be able to visualize it to the people who need it. So if I give an account to somebody, I want them to get the nasty gram. I think I was the wall of shame customer, but I want them to get the nasty gram that they've done something wrong. Ideally, I've already auto-remediated it for them. But a lot of times you're not going to be able to auto-remediate if somebody does something wrong, because maybe it's a production app and you're not willing to take that risk. Again, if you catch it quick enough and you have CI/CD process, maybe there is no problem with the risk. But so I didn't want to write that visualization because there's you have to figure out how am I going to identify my users, how am I going to isolate them, how am I going to do all these different concerns, and then finding ways to follow up with them. So that was one of my big concerns when I approached Evan&IO, and so. One of the nice things about Evan&IO is we share kind of a big account background. John with Adobe, and actually Tim, the CEO with Adobe, and I know they have other people from other big accounts, and so they actually understood kind of the perspective that we had. So getting it, separating it out, self-healing remediation. Essentially, we use Evan&IO for all account provisioning. So things that I create, things that Evan&IO actually creates today, end up being like security groups. And so we have a dev account and we have a prod account. Well, so the Ellie Mae public security group is actually different across both those environments. So in the prod account, we'll have it'll be open to any IP address on the internet. While in the dev accounts, I work with the network team. I understand what our IP prefixes are. So it's actually isolated to just, you have to be on the Ellie Mae network to be able to access it. So, and from a CI/CD, that's very attractive. Essentially, my developers, they can reference the same security group name, programmatically query the name, or have a way to derive the security group ID. And they can use the same one across environments. So their CI/CD pipeline is essentially the same. And basically, it's transparent to them, so it's not like where I'm tweaking this for production, and then that's the part that breaks, and nobody likes looking like a loser. So there's a lot of being able to do really clever things with crossing the account barriers and setting things up. But we use it right now, Evan&IO, for setting up the entire account. So if there's a CloudTrail that needs to be set up, we do it. Account alias, we're still working on maturing up so that we can properly use single sign-on, but I've already got that plumbing done. It took it took an hour to get that plumbing for doing the IAM single sign-on trust, and so essentially we do everything. I set up a couple roles, and then configure it in Evident.io, and then essentially before I hand it out to my developers, I make sure that all the Evident.io checks pass. If any of them don't pass, it's essentially a bug of some sort. Maybe Amazon introduced a different way an API works, or maybe there's some small changes. This is one of the problems with working with any of this automation around accounts, is they're always announcing new things, organizations or something else, or they announced Frankfurt where they don't support the old V2 signing and they only support V4. That was I don't know if anybody went through that, but that was a lot of fun. So essentially we use this automation around essentially doing everything, and this is really the how we scale, and a small team to be able to service a lot of people is exporting the work to people that actually own the business logic and people who actually honestly own responsibility for fixing the problem. So it helps this sort of you build it, you run it mentality that we really want to push. So I'll cover more of the details as we move forward, especially around how we do some of these things. Because if I jump too far ahead, then I don't have anything to talk about later, and I can keep talking. So I'm going to hand it back over to John.
Awesome.
Give a couple more slides of eye candy, and let's
All right.
talk more about it.
Sounds good. Let's talk a little bit about the CIS AWS Foundations Benchmark. How many of you are familiar with it? How many of you have implemented some kind of scoring around the benchmark? Cool. How many of you are meeting the Foundations benchmark 100%? Oh, wow. Awesome. Nice. So let's talk a little bit about it. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Foundations benchmark, it's a really great set of guidelines. I liken it to that scene in Pirates of the Caribbean, where Barbossa is talking about the rules for pirates, right? It's just, they're not actually rules as much as they are guidelines. CIS Foundations Benchmark exists as a very basic way to score security in your AWS accounts. It's really one of those things that we believe pretty much everybody should be testing themselves against. It's a little bit of the behind the scenes, so I was actually part of the committee that came up with the benchmarks, and including CIS and AWS, and it was a lot of work. So we had to sort of sit through these phone calls and try and figure out which are the things that we want to put in as a very basic sort of check against my AWS accounts. And we came out, the benchmark came out eventually. And we think that we did a relatively pretty good job. And there's going to be more updates to the benchmark, obviously. But the benchmark is definitely something that will guide you. We treat the benchmark actually as a sort of a basic compliant set of controls. So even though it's not necessarily, it's not really an industry standard compliance a standard, but it's something that every AWS customer we believe should strive to reach. The benchmark has some good things in it. It's got things like looking at your MFA tokens in your accounts. It's got things like making sure that some basic encryption settings are right and all of that stuff. So definitely, I would take a look at it if you haven't seen it yet, all of the controls there. But one of the things that you'll find in the benchmark at the very end is a score sheet that you can go and take your self-assessment and score yourself in your AWS accounts where you are. So I will announce today as well that Evident.io, we have an automated CIS Foundations benchmark scoring system that's built into the platform. So when you turn on Evident.io with the Evident Security platform, as part of your subscription, we're giving you the scoring sheet checklist of the CIS Foundations benchmark. So you can really quickly at a glance take a look at, why the hell do I have all those red X's going on, right? What's all that stuff going on? So, and I do have a couple of check marks there that I'm passing all of the controls. But regardless, I have a nice programmatic continuous view against the benchmark that I can go and take and hand off to my boss or whoever, right? Or even to myself, right? So that I can take a look at across my environment how I'm doing against the CIS Foundation's benchmark. So we believe, again, that those sets of controls are something that every AWS customer should go and adhere to. So that's the Foundation's benchmark. So I'm going to pass it back to Anthony so that Anthony can talk about compliance. Compliance is not something pleasant necessarily, but...
Yeah, John told me he took that screenshot from their prod account, so, you know. So Ellie Mae, compliance is very important for us. I mentioned earlier that we process mortgage transactions, and we have to operate much like a bank, maybe in some ways even more secure, paranoid, because you know, with a bank you may get their their date of birth or social security number. We actually have 7 or 10 years of employment history, and we know who all these things, all these hoops that you go through for getting approved for a loan. All that data resides within us. So our compliance story is essentially has to be watertight, and as a result, we get audited constantly. We have an entire team that they're underneath our security, and I guess we call it security and compliance, but they do nothing really but handle auditing and making sure that all our software we're using is proper, making sure that we meet things like the CSI benchmark, and they have a huge platform, and so we're bound by some really interesting constraints when we have to go and design something. So I give an idea. Today, even with Evan and IO, when they send me an SMS message with remediation, I actually still don't even trust that. I actually store a separate config of my remediation, and I actually pull that from an S3 bucket for making sure that I'm not, it's a zero trust type thing, right? There's nothing wrong with remediating the same thing 2 or 3 times because it's only going to make it to the right state, so there's really no harm in that as long as I've done my remediation code right. But if somebody's able to inject something and say, go create an IAM policy that trusts this other AWS account, that's a problem for me. So even though I love Evan and IO, and we do give them a bit of trust, the roles they have in my account are read-only and zero trust policy. So with compliance, we end up with making sure that our encryptions are insane and everything like along those. So already, with the CIS benchmark, I've already been asking John to make sure that this is extendable, that it's not just a CIS compliance benchmark, because I'm writing custom code also against my accounts, and my compliance teams have business requirements that I have to adhere to for compliance. So one of the attractive things was the ability to essentially take my custom code, my custom checks, and be able to match those to my compliance needs for running an AWS. And what that essentially does is now my compliance guys will be able to log in. This is something I didn't have at Nokia, which is actually a big win. My compliance guys will actually be able to log in, and whenever those PCI compliance guys come in and they say, well, tell us about an AWS account and what you're doing, they will be able to log into Evan and IO and go to literally an aggregate report of everything. And they'll be able to, if we do right, hopefully see check marks all the way down to show that we are indeed compliant. And the great thing about it is, the prove it becomes just digging a little bit deeper in the whole story here. So, if it's my own code that's doing it, my own Java code that's out of band, that's convoluted with a whole bunch of other Java code, then you're really stuck demangling this, and it's really hard to prove, no matter how technical or untechnical that auditor is. So I like this idea of being able to show a compliance report. Well, what does that mean, that check mark? And you say, well, these checks here are doing that, and say it's a really technical guy. Well, what code is doing that? And you can hop into it. So it's a really nice narrative, and I'm actually looking forward to being able to implement it for our compliance guys and security as well. So these reports also are shareable with security. And my whole point is I want them to actually go and look at it. I don't actually want to once it's done, I never want to actually look at Evan.io again because I have 1,000 people in the company that should be doing it. So that's really, Ellie Mae, this is really kind of this new next-gen compliance story that we've never been able to really achieve with sort of our private cloud that we're actually able to gain with this move to public cloud. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you, John.
Awesome. Another thing I'm going to talk about really quickly here is AWS Security by Design. So from the get-go, the AWS Security by Design program is really a recommended approach to proactive security. A lot of it, obviously, because it is run by AWS, is based on CloudFormation. So templating your environments, or CloudFormation is the implementation of that in AWS, is a really great way to set up your baseline for your environment. So I used CloudFormation extensively in previous jobs, and the one thing I really liked about it was that I can literally stamp out my environments. I can clone a VPC here or VPC there and be on my way. So the Security by Design program gives us that practical approach. One of the things that is visible if you look at that link that's down there in the Security by Design link is a really nice matrix. So you can learn how to create this matrix that allows you to map out your own controls in your environment. What controls do I need to put in my environment to make sure that this AWS account meets my requirements, basically? And then you flow from that into a CloudFormation template, something that implements those controls in a very active fashion. So if we look at the workflow, we can say, okay, we've got this controls matrix that I've built. I want my AWS environments to look like this. And then we go and write a CloudFormation template that stamps it out. And then we go proactively and continuously look at those environments and make sure that I'm testing. That's where things like CIS Foundations Benchmark, et cetera, come in. So I did want to show a little bit of code. Not everything is a panacea in these types of this type of world. If we look closely here at this CloudFormation template, I can quickly see what I would call sort of a rat hole that I can get into that ensures automation breaks my stuff until I go fix it, right? So what I'm looking at here is a CloudFormation template that goes and opens up port 22 accidentally. I'm writing this CloudFormation template. A lot of us don't write code at 3 in the morning, right? So, I'm not really tired or anything like that, or I haven't had, that extra latte before I get on my coding binge in the middle of the night. But what I can see is in that section that I've missed something. I've missed this little quick thing. I don't know why I put 0.0.0/0 there for my CIDR IP address on the ingress rule, but I did it. And all of a sudden now, I've got an auto-scaling group that goes and launches 50 EC2 instances with that security group, all from CloudFormation. So what I wanted to show you with this example here is that, security by design, templating my environments is great, but we still have to make sure that we follow what I talked a little bit about earlier, code testing, right? And it shows that just because I'm creating infrastructure doesn't mean that it's not code, right? So this is one of the other things that you should take a look at, is to make sure that all of your code is clean and that you're actually testing against that code as well, and then you're looking at it. So this is one thing. How many of you are analyzing your CloudFormation templates for security pitfalls? Awesome. So just really quickly, what tools are you using to analyze your templates? Homegrown? Homegrown stuff, right? Right. And I saw somebody else raise their hand, same kind of thing. You're writing something that basically ingests the JSON file, the objects, and then goes and analyzes the security. So absolutely. So that's one of the approaches, obviously. So avoid those security pitfalls because they do exist. They do happen. So another area in our platform that you can gain some of this automation is through our custom signatures interface. We give you the ability in the platform, like we showed earlier with the CIS benchmark testing. We do have very prescriptive tests in your environment. We cover a lot of different AWS services. built into our platform. But in addition to that, we also make the claim that we support pretty much every single AWS service, minus the ones that were just announced, right? Because it does take some time to propagate into our platform. But we have a custom signatures interface. What this interface does in our platform is that it allows you to extend to make all of the testing that you need to get done for your environment. I talked about security by design and the controls matrix. Well, a lot of the controls you're going to come up with are not going to be things that Anthony cares about necessarily. Your IP address, your IP egress address space is not going to be the same as Ellie Mae's, right? You're going to have something else. So if you're writing standards and controls for security groups, as an example, you're tagging standards as an example, those are going to be things that only you and your organization care about. So that's the intent of the custom signatures interface, as well as, we don't have signatures for every single AWS service. I don't even know. Do you know, Anthony, how many AWS services there are now?
I lost count.
Yeah, right? the big, huge fire hose. If somebody knows out there, please definitely let us know. But the idea here is for you to extend our platform and to be able to write, because God knows that for a long time in my environment, I had to do a lot of scripting for myself, where I had to go and write these automations and throw them in some kind of cron job or Jenkins, et cetera, to go do all of this for me. So the basics of it is that if you can write it in the Ruby SDK for AWS, you can write it into our platform. So that's really what it comes down to. An example use case for these things, use cases would be enforcing tagging standards, where you have I need to have, maybe one tag for my cost center number, one tag for the owner of that particular resource, et cetera. Another one would be, again, like I talked about, the egress space issue. Enforcing custom SSL ciphers on my load balancers is another one. We do have an open source repo that you can go and look at and look through and get some signatures. I'm showing one example here. So in this example code here, what we can see here, it's relatively easy. Using Ruby. How many of you guys are Ruby people? Rubyists? Not very many. Python? A lot more hands, yeah. I get it. It looks very similar. The methods in Bodo are very similar. I'll have a Python example later on. Don't worry. But really, what it comes down to, much like using the SDKs, we support a lot of the same constructs in the custom signatures interface. In fact, this is relatively native Ruby code. So you can see here that I do have the EC2 object inherited, but I go and scan through all my images, all my AMIs in the accounts. And again, we're propagating through all of the accounts that you've given us access to. And what I'm doing is, as I loop through each image, I'm actually checking whether to see that image has the public bit set on it. This one's a little bit more intentional. For me to have a public AMI, I have to be sort of intentional about it. But I've seen it. I've seen it in cases where, this image doesn't necessarily need to be public. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a custom signature that goes and checks that. And down at the end, if it's public, the logic goes here is if it's public, generate a fail alert. So in our system, you're going to see a fail message. Otherwise, it's a pass. So again, relatively simple to do, very customizable. I definitely spin up a lot of custom signatures that have some pretty gnarly regex in them. So it's definitely something that you absolutely can do in your environment. So again, I'll pass it over to Anthony so you can talk a little bit about this.
So the custom signatures you just go. I'll give you the best use case I found right now is we use it to deploy Lambdas to all of our accounts. So I think talking about horizontal enablers and making sure that all accounts are at the right state. And so we have for our centralized logging platform essentially set up a log stream on CloudWatch Logs so that you can get those logs out of some of the services that natively log to it. So one of the challenges is you provision an account and you set it up and maybe you use CloudFormation to deploy it and you set up a little version 1.0 in the description to try to remember which one you set and now you've got this job of having to go and scan it. And so we essentially using the SHA-256 that's exposed in the API. We pull it with Evident.io. We check that against the SHA-256 of the authoritative place that we store it, which is in a secure bucket, and this essentially our management account that does all the remediation as well. And if the SHA-256 doesn't work, we spin up an error and we say go auto remediate that, and essentially we then go into and update that Lambda, completely transparent. We never delete because deleting can result in some bad stuff. So it's always updates. This is one of the lessons learned of managing is you can't delete you can't delete IAM profiles, you can't delete IAM roles because all those roles are associated to things. It's really pure remediation. You have to go and delete the policies that don't exist there, update the Lambdas to be the right code, update the descriptions and the memory parameters around the Lambda if that's your bug that you have. But essentially being able to, the power of being able to sit here and say, wow, my Lambda has a bug, it ran out of memory because we found some new bug, but being able to sit here and confidently put something in there, deploy it to your dev accounts first to make sure you don't break some regression, and then roll it out to your production accounts is actually very powerful. Around this, so the way we treat Evident.io is very programmatic. We use their APIs exclusively for provisioning artifacts inside of them. So actually, after talking to several Evident.io customers who share the same concerns, I'm actually going to work on after reInvent, working on opening up some of our platforms. Essentially, they revolve around using YAML files and trying to get code reuse out of these custom signatures. So ultimately, I want to work with John to be able to get that into the core platform. But there's a lot of the nice thing about the platform is it allows you to be able to it's just like AWS. Every MVP of AWS, everybody's felt it. You're like, why doesn't it do this? Why doesn't it do this? And you send a note to support, and they say, well, here's the workaround. The nice thing about the platform is they built it flexible enough that you can actually work around it. So we've been doing that, and they're very open ears, which is nice. And so we work on we're kind of a team together working to make it happen. So I would say that's Ellie Mae using Evident.io for success is a bit of a partnership, and we don't want to run out of too much time. So go ahead, John.
Awesome, yeah. So the last section that we're going to talk about is exploiting the bots. So here's where we get into the meat of the discussion, right? So we'll talk about this little section really quickly, but what can I do now? Now that I've implemented all of these controls, now that I've got some automated testing and programmatic testing, I've written things to a point where I am writing some custom checks in my environment and adhering to a security by design platform where I'm doing things proactively. What can I do now? I alluded to it a little bit earlier, taking advantage of AWS's serverless compute service, Lambda, right? Great service that you can definitely use to trigger functions to go do this work for you. How many of you guys are using Lambda extensively? Awesome, that's great. Absolutely, it was one of those things that got deployed in AWS as a service that I absolutely have been waiting for all my life, and I didn't really know that it was there. So one of the really nice things about this is from the self-healing perspective, this is where I can react to changes in my environment. I talked a little bit earlier about nuking things out of orbit. I can definitely do that. And an example I'm going to show you here is auto-remediating that port 22 open to the world. So this is where I get into, I've used Evident.io to generate an alert for this particular issue. I've integrated SNS to be able to send this alert via the message over to Lambda, and I go and trigger the Lambda function. And what this Lambda function does is it goes and takes the alert that we've generated, so we spit out JSON to you, and I've gone and ingested this, and at the very end here, this is where I'm doing the nuking here in the function. I go and revoke that rule that I've discovered in my environment. So again, this is exploitability at its finest, self-healing, right? As issues come up, I'm going to go and generate the alert and go fix it. So it's something that that I can use to my advantage. These are the robots that I have access to. Let's see. So other areas that you can exploit, not necessarily Lambda, related, but you can. Automatic rollback, we talked about. Failover to other regions, I discussed really quickly. Automated creation of quarantine environments. Definitely something to explore. Absolutely, as I've gone through the travels, I've had instances that have been exploited, instances that have been taken over by bad guys. So quarantining those environments, creating a VPC automatically, copying, taking a snapshot of that instance and going and moving it off to this quarantine environment. It's a really good use case for using a lot of automation. So we're going to talk really quickly about how Ellie Mae is doing some of that self-healing.
I think I hit on it. We only
Awesome.
got a few minutes, so let's roll through.
Perfect. So we've come to the end. Taking stock of your environment. How would you rate yourself? This is, partly the pain meter, right? How do I rate myself? Am I all the way on the red side? Am I somewhere in the middle? Or am I totally on the green, right? How would you rate yourself? Who would say you're in the red? You need a lot of work to do. And that's fine to be honest, There's a lot of us that here. How many of you guys are somewhere in the middle? You've got stuff to do still, but I've got a lot of cool stuff going on. And how many of us are totally in the green? Right?
Nice.
It's okay.
Come see me after the show.
It's quite all right. So again, Ellie Mae has a great story to tell. Thank you very much for staying with us. We will both be, Anthony and I will both be down at our booth. We'll be here for a few minutes still, but we'll both be down at our booth in 404. And I did want to say that all the code samples that I showed today are accessible on this GitHub repo. The slides obviously will be accessible as well eventually, but definitely come see us down at the booth. We'd absolutely love to talk to you. So thank you very much.